Seasonic, the heart of your system.
I'm Neil Woodard for Kit Guru. We saw Phanteks Luxe 2 at Computex this year, both empty and also with 3 different builds inside, because there are a great many options with this case. I often think you can judge a product initially by the quality of the accessory pack you get with it, if indeed you get an accessory pack, and in particular by the documentation. Phanteks always does a good job of documentation. With the Luxe 2 it's no different story. So we've got a full glass panel on the Luxe 2, where previously we had a window in the main panel. The panel hinges open and lifts away to reveal a cavernous interior that can accommodate a vast range of cooling. The top and front panels lift away quite easily, a couple of thumb screws for the top. That lifts away to reveal a filter. Front then just pulls off. There's no optical drive bay with this case, just a front I/O. Inside you can, if you choose, install a dual system, or you can install one mighty system with a load of cooling. There's RGB, and then around the back of the case, even the back panel has a nod to the aesthetic. There's a small window to show off your RGB SSDs. There really is a great deal to admire about this case, and I cannot wait to get into the detail. The Luxe 2 clearly gets its name from the original Luxe. However, the styling looks to me more like a mashup of the Primo and the Elite. Those curved panels, which are aluminium, look very elite to my eyes. Looking through the glass into the main compartment, you can see there is integrated RGB on the main power supply cover. The lighting runs the length of the top of the case and down the front. With your Luxe 2 on the bench, it's time to start making decisions. Unlike, for example, the Elite from Phanteks or the 1000D from Corsair, where you can put any hardware you want in the case. In fact, you're obliged to put a lot of hardware in those cases, otherwise they just look empty. The only limitation I'm aware of with the Luxe 2, and I'm using limitation in an ironic manner, are motherboards that support the 28-core Intel Xeon W3175X, which is no limitation whatsoever, because those boards have a massive amount of space up top for VRMs. In this instance, the motherboard is an Asus ROG Rampage 6 Extreme, which is an E-ATX board, and it goes in easy peasy, and you've got full access to the cable management grommets. Now in this context, the power supply goes around the back, I'll show you in a second, and you've got a load of space here for cooling. You might wonder why there is so much space here, and that's a perfectly valid point. It's for the options that you have with this case. A conventional ATX power supply, such as this Seasonic Prime Platinum, simply slides in place like that, and if I offer up the back panel, you'll see it has a filtered intake for the power supply. Alternatively, we take this Phanteks Revolt X, which is made by Seasonic, and that has dual system capability. You can plug in one set of PC components there and a second set along here. You see, in the box you get 2 24-pin cables plus all the other bits and pieces you require. So this power supply in the back of the case can supply 2 systems. Remove the blanking plate, and there's another plate that comes off. Take this plate, which comes in the accessory pack, and now we're ready to install a mini ITX motherboard. 4 standoffs. Common sense says I'm going to take this radiator rack out, because there's no way I'm going to be using that with ITX in the bottom. And we're ready for the board. And then you feed your power cables through, and the Revolt X power supply can supply both motherboards. If you're going the dual system route, you use the power button to turn on and off your main system, and you repurpose the reset button to power the secondary system. These buttons are to do with RGB. There's nothing to prevent you, of course, splitting the USB 3.1 type A's. So you could have, for example, that pair on the secondary system and that pair on the main system. The alternative approach is to power your system with dual power supplies. This requires the Phanteks Revolt Pro. I don't have one of those, but I'm going to pretend I do and use a Seasonic Prime Platinum. If the second power supply was a Revolt Pro, we would now have backup and protection against a failed power supply. You may have no interest whatsoever in one power supply operating two systems, or indeed two power supplies operating one system. They are clearly niche interests. But consider this, to make those systems work, the power supplies have to go in the case vertically, which is no big deal. That means you can get the two power supplies side by side on the floor of the case. That in turn means the case has to be taller. So the downside to those design choices are the case is tall. In addition, you need some extra bracketry. Now look at the bracketry that's been supplied. So that's the power supply blanking plate in the rear of the case with this blanking plate over it. They're flat pieces of stamped steel. They'd cost pennies. In addition, you have to have this mini ITX bracket. So that's obviously the I/O panel for the mini ITX, and that's where your graphics card goes. Again, stamped steel, again, minimal cost. Easy to package, easy to install. The cost to Phanteks of giving you these options is minimal. However, they also have opportunities. Consider this case is £185. A high-end power supply, such as the Phanteks Seasonic power supplies, they are £200 to £250 each. You might potentially have two power supplies in this case, so they're selling you a £185 case and about £500 of power supplies. That's a nice business model. There are further opportunities. This space here, if you have your main system up top, single graphics card, perhaps vertically mounted, you can buy from Phanteks an accessory bracket that goes down the bottom to give you a second vertical GPU mount. So Phanteks is using this space here to give you the opportunity to do something unique, which is two vertical GPUs. But there are more options. You can put cooling down the bottom, and clearly with this space here, you can have a super thick radiator with push-pull fans without any difficulty whatsoever. You are far away from the motherboard. But in addition to that, you can use this space, if you want, to install storage. You can install a huge amount of storage inside this case. Hard drives, 3.5-inch hard drives, would you believe, a dozen, 12. I've installed this Asus Vega 64 graphics card, which is a big beefy thing, just to demonstrate that this space here is entirely unrestricted by the graphics card. If we want to install hard drives here, we pop out these blanking covers, 4 of them. These are 120mm fan mounting locations, 4 plates. Phanteks supplies 4 of these drive caddies in the accessory pack. Each one can accommodate a 3.5-inch hard drive. It slides in place, grommets already installed, securing screws on either side, and then you can offer the caddy up to the mounting plate, put it in there, a couple of thumb screws in the back to secure it in place. So it's like that. Using this approach, we can stack the cages up as high as we like, and of course the cables are coming through to the back side of the chassis, which means they're easy to connect to your power supply. Alternatively, we use these mounting clips engaged in these grooves here, and we take a second caddy and we stack them up. As you can see, that cable grommet is ideally located to feed the power to your hard drives. You might find this hard to believe, but Luxe 2 supports at least 15 2.5-inch SSDs. The most obvious and stylish position of these 3 sleds on the back, 2 installed, 1 there with this SK Hynix SSD screwed in. Drops down, and you can see the SSDs through the window in the back panel. Very neat and tidy. A quirky way to install an SSD is to take one of those 3.5-inch drive bays and use these 4 mounting holes, but you can't simply put the drive on top because it doesn't fit in this recess. So you need to put the drive on the inside face like that, and then you can mount the caddy in one of the many positions I showed you a moment ago, the 3.5-inch drives. So that's another 4 mounts, but personally I'd ignore this. And then we come to Phanteks' genius moment. If we take one of these blanks, we can use these 4 mounting holes there to simply attach an SSD. I'll line it up so you get the exact look correctly, like so. Okay, like that. Or if you choose, you can flip it. As we know, sometimes the label's the wrong way. So if I take, actually, yeah, That SanDisk there has the cable connections to this side, whereas the Corsair has the connections going to this side. So depending on the orientation, you can flip it. Okay, that's dead straightforward. Full mounting hole, so we're talking about using your conventional screws, SSD on the front face, easy peasy. The genius part is that you can also take the same mount, you've got a couple of little plastic pins here, offer up the mounting holes in the SSD, et voila. From that side you can't see anything. There you go. On this face we've got an SSD installed. And the doubly extra clever part is you can mount an SSD on the front. Each of these 4 blanks can accommodate 2 2.5-inch SSDs simultaneously. Blimey, can Luxe 2 handle air cooling. We've got 15 Phanteks F120 fans in the case and a mighty Be Quiet Dark Rock TF. In the side position, we've got 4 120s. You cannot mount 140s there, and the Luxe 2 does not support 200mm fans. At the rear of the Luxe 2, we can have a single 120 or 140. You'll note this is an oddball white fan I had to drag off the shelf to make up the full complement. In the bottom of the case, we have 3 120s, or we could put a single 140 at the front, and naturally we have a full-length dust filter. At the front we've got 4 120s, the alternative is 3 140s, and again, full-length dust filter. In the roof we have 3 120s, the alternative here is 3 140s, and again, fully filtered. So depending on your choice of fans, you can have 15 120s or 8 140s. It's time to talk liquid cooling. I'll get to the radiators in a moment, but first these components. So we have here a Phanteks C360i CPU block, and here we have the brand new D140 rear distro plate that we saw at Computex. Graphics card is Founders Edition RTX 2080 with a Phanteks block, mounted as you'll see horizontally because I want to use the bottom of the case for cooling. I'm also going to add this pump reservoir unit, but for now that will just muddy the waters. We want some clarity about this area here. One of the virtues of using all Phanteks is you can daisy chain the RGB lighting together. Very nifty. Luxe 2 accommodates a 360 rad in the floor, 360 rad in the roof, 480 rad in the side, 480 rad in the front, but not simultaneously. That's the key thing. These Alphacool radiators are each 30mm in thickness, which is a conventional size, so relatively slender. More chunky radiators, for example, in the bottom, no trouble whatsoever. It's quite clear you could easily have a 60mm rad in the bottom. So what we've got here is a 360 Alphacool pushed to the rear with the unions at the rear, which gives you heaps of space at the front. We've got the fans on the inside of the chassis as they have to be, and there's no difficulty installing a radiator there in terms of thickness. Where we do have a problem with the front radiator, and I've taken that top fan out to give me space to feed the rad up and in, is it can just about go in, but it doesn't go in far enough because of that side radiator, so it cannot mount on the fans. Worth pointing out, the fans on the side position are outside the chassis, so this is giving you the maximum space inside. That side radiator, realistically, that's a problem. The top rad is a 240. Clearly, if it was a 360, it would extend all the way here. That's simply not going to work because the rad would be absolutely overlapping that union. So once again, top or side radiator, the side rad being the problem. However, it's not only the length of the radiator, it's also the fact it drops down and it's covering the memory. If you were to attempt to install a 140 or 280 radiator on these mounts here, you'd run into massive clearance problems. A 140 or 280 fan is possible, but even that's not ideal. The top is best reserved for 120mm fans. During the introduction I said this case doesn't support optical drives. That is true, it doesn't come with optical drive bays, however Phanteks sells an accessory you can install. It's fairly obvious from their picture, I don't have the accessory here, that if you install optical drive bays you are reducing your options for cooling significantly. One of the nifty features Phanteks has included with Luxe 2 is a 20mm cutout for a fill port. This is from Alphacool. Drops in like so. There's also a 20mm drain cutout. The snag here is if you have a full height side mounted radiator, it absolutely clashes with that fill port. My takeaway here is that a bottom 360 rad makes perfect sense, a top rad makes very little sense, side rad is difficult, front rad easy peasy. The question of whether you go for a full height 480 or do something bizarre like a 240 there and a 240 there, or a 240 there and a 240 there, personally, I'm not interested in that, but that might work. So I'm going to finish up this build with rad in the bottom, fans in the roof, rad at the front. Not yet decided if I'm going to go for fans in the side or use the blanking plates and just cover up those mounting holes completely. The custom loop cooling system is constructed around the D140 distribution plate at the rear of the chassis, so the two radiators and the pump reservoir are connected to the D140, and then you have tubes feeding off to the CPU and the GPU separately. It's a very neat system. Bleeding it took a little while, however it does mean you don't have any tubes strung across the centre of the case. Perhaps with hindsight I should have used a 360 cross-flow radiator in the floor of the case to avoid having a tube running the length of the chassis, but other than that I think it's ended up looking pretty decent. I like the glass panel on the side of the case. I'm going to remove it however because the tint is diminishing the RGB. With the glass removed you can see there's foam material here which avoids an annoying chink when the door closes. It also means that the door seals to the main chassis very neatly. And that actually is indicative of what Phanteks has done with the Luxe 2. That foam tape would have cost almost nothing. It serves a decent purpose, it functions, it's neat, it's tidy, and that is true of pretty much every aspect of this case. In conclusion, there is nothing about this chassis I actively dislike. There are a couple of minor gripes that I have, but they are minor. So for example, the steel of the core chassis, particularly in the roof, is quite flexy. When I was installing the fans, I had to support the fan on the inside while I was screwing into it. If you literally just lean down, the steel flexes. Similarly with the hook and loop straps on the back of the chassis, that system works superbly well. When you're hooking the Velcro straps into place, if you pull on the steel too hard, you can actually bend this steel. It's thin. The only other point is a fundamental point about the chassis, which is that the case is very tall. Therefore, you have this space in the bottom. You have to use it, otherwise the case just looks bizarre. But you have, as I've said a few times now, many options as to what you can do down here. I would have liked the chassis to be slightly wider. That 360 rad there is quite slender and there is very little space to work with. A few more mil would have helped, would have given more options. Similarly, a few more mil in the other compartment would have helped cable management. The cables are in fairly neatly, but then this is a single system with a single power supply. Once you start, particularly if you had dual power supplies, but once you add more power cables, cable management is going to be a problem without a shadow of a doubt. Slightly wider would have been better. The connection of fans was the point that caused me the single most hassle during this build, because you've got a brilliant little fan hub in the roof of the case. We've seen this before with Phanteks, it works superbly well. The snag is I've installed many more fans in the chassis than the fan hub can accommodate. I was using a selection of fan hubs such as that, so 3 or 4 fans going to one unit and then one connection going off to the fan hub. That didn't work. That's not a criticism of Phanteks, it's not reasonable to daisy chain hubs to hubs and then expect one single connection going to the motherboard to work. I mean, how can the motherboard fathom out what on earth you're doing? So what I ended up doing was I've got a couple of hubs around the back where I've connected to one header on the motherboard. That works perfectly well. So the fan hub is controlling most of the fans, and then I've got a couple of mini extra fan hubs. The thing is, if I was to say to Phanteks you need to support, for example, 16 fans in this chassis, well, that would be unreasonable. How many people are going to use 16 fans? So the approach they've taken makes perfect sense, but it does mean you're going to have to potentially do extra work based on your exact configuration. I've used the Phanteks RGB system rather than using a digital RGB connection to my motherboard, although this case supports both approaches. The reason I've stuck with the Phanteks system is it works so well, and I've used Phanteks cooling throughout. So we've got Phanteks RGB on the graphics block, the rear distro plate, the reservoir, and also the CPU block, plus the case itself. Looks absolutely superb, and you get a surprising array of lighting choices using just the integrated lighting. Phanteks RGB, to my mind, is the best that there is. in terms of how the system hooks together and the features that you get based purely on the hardware functions of the case. No extra software required. If you go down the digital RGB route where you're connecting to your motherboard, then you're using the motherboard software or the system software. But this system as it comes is absolutely excellent. But obviously I'm using all Phanteks hardware. If I was trying to mix and match other makes of hardware, it would be a different story altogether. Cooling and temperatures in this case, absolutely excellent. So the processor is an i9-7980XE, which is the 18 core and 7th gen, therefore non-soldered heat spreader. Out of the box, just stock settings apart from enabling XMP for the G.Skill TridentZ memory, which is running 3200 megahertz. The processor idled at 32 Celsius, which is about 10 above ambient, and under full load it was running at 52. The clock speed of this processor is quite low. I tried some overclocking experiments just to see what happened, and when I overclocked modestly, the temperature pushed up to 72. When I reviewed the i9 9000 series 18 core, I was comparing the 7000 to the 9000, and if you pump more power into it, I mean, you can go up to 400 watts, you can easily overheat the processor. It's a function of the processor rather than the cooling system. The cooling system can handle anything you throw at it. Graphics temperature, the RTX 2080 Founders Edition with a Phanteks block idled at 28 and was 45 degrees under load. Again, stock clocks. When it comes to cooling and air flow, the Luxe 2 is excellent. Obviously it depends on the hardware you install, both in terms of processor, graphics card or cards plural, how many radiators you install, whether you're using push pull, how many fans you have, a great many unknowns, but the case itself works really well. The fact it comes without any fans goes back to the heart of what Phanteks has done with Luxe 2. This is a £185 case. It is essentially a budget chassis. I know it sounds bizarre to say, but it is. So they've cut costs here and there by giving you a sensible number of accessories, a sensible number of drive bays without giving you all the options. The fact you have to install fans, clearly you could spend as much on the fans as you do on the bare chassis. And as I said previously, the power supply is likely to cost you more than the bare chassis. Overall, as you may have deduced by now, I think Luxe 2 is quite superb. Clearly, it's not going to fit under many desks, or indeed on many desks. Obviously not. Most people do not require this full tower chassis. If you're looking for a big chassis to install a serious system or two systems, Luxe 2 is an absolutely excellent starting point. Clearly you have to work with it and install a load of extra hardware. The chassis is just the starting point. As a closing note, the D140 distro plate at the rear, that's a neat piece of work. When I saw it at Computex, I didn't know what to think. You see distro plates typically at the front of a chassis. Very rarely do you see them anywhere else. Having it at the rear, it makes a lot of sense. It's close to the graphics card, it's close to the CPU, those tube runs, very short, really helps to neaten up your build. I like that a lot. That's it, Luxe 2, done, and deeply impressed. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the bell button, subscribe, we'll alert you to new videos as they become available. I'm Leo Ward for Kit Guru. This is the Phanteks Enthoo Luxe 2.